The vote was already over when I walked into the chamber. I knew it before I saw the board. I knew it from the way the Velhari delegation refused to meet my eyes, from the way the Sarathi observer folded all four of its arms inward, a gesture their species made only when they were certain something irreversible had just happened. I knew it from the silence, which was the wrong kind of silence, the kind that follows a verdict rather than a debate. My name is Kai Marin. At the time I was 34 years old, a junior liaison officer assigned to the United Earth diplomatic mission, and I had spent the last 18 months working inside the galactic conclave on behalf of my species. I had believed in that work. I had believed that patience, reason, and an honest record of human achievement would matter. I had believed the council was, at its heart, a fair institution. I stopped believing that on the day they sentenced my entire world without calling a single human being to speak. The chamber of the galactic conclave was enormous, a curved hall of pale stone that seated representatives from 61 recognized species, arranged in concentric rings around a central floor of polished dark material that reflected everything above it like still water. The acoustics were perfect. Every whisper carried, every breath was audible. It had been designed that way on purpose, so that no delegate could claim they had not heard the words spoken in that room. Director Edia Asai stood alone on the central floor. She was 61 years old, short, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from discipline. She had spent 4 decades in international diplomacy before taking the role of Earth's senior representative to the conclave. She did not move when I entered. She was watching the board. The board showed the vote count: 61 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstained. 61 species had agreed without a single dissenting voice that humanity was to be quarantined in the Sol system, permanently sealed behind a containment field, cut off from all galactic trade routes, all communications networks, all transit lanes, no ships in, no ships out. The field would be constructed and activated within 1 galactic standard year, approximately 11 of our months. The official language of the decree called it protective separation. It said that humanity represented an unpredictable and biologically aggressive variable in the galactic community, that our rate of expansion, our reaction to stress, our lack of deference to established hierarchies, and our persistent tendency to form unsanctioned alliances with pre-contact civilizations made us a threat to galactic stability. The decree was 40 pages long. It had clearly been written well in advance of the vote. Someone had been planning this for a long time. I stood at the edge of the chamber floor and felt the weight of 61 alien delegations watching me. Some of them looked away. The Sarathi kept their arms folded. The Velhari ambassador, a tall, silver-robed figure named Counselor Veth, turned his face toward the wall, not the vote board, not the floor, the wall, as if looking at something none of the rest of us could see. The conclave's senior presiding voice, species called the Andri, spoke from the top ring in that slow, resonant tone that always sounded like a cathedral organ at low volume. The motion carries the decree of protective separation regarding the human-occupied system of Sol is hereby recorded and binding. Implementation will begin within the Standard year. The human delegation is thanked for its presence and dismissed. Thanked for its presence as if we had been invited. Director Asai did not move for a long moment. She stood on that reflective floor with her folder closed under her arm, and she looked up at the board one final time, then she turned and walked toward me. Her face was unreadable, not angry, not devastated, just completely, carefully blank. "Walk with me," she said quietly. We walked out of the chamber together. The doors closed behind us with a sound like the whole galaxy exhaling. In the corridor outside, I finally let myself speak. They didn't let us argue. They didn't allow testimony. They drafted the decree and held the vote. And it was done before we even knew the session was scheduled. "Yes," she said. "That's not due process. That's not what the conclave charter promises. We have rights under Article 14, the right to present evidence, the right to respond to." Kai, her voice was quiet and firm. "Article 14 applies to member species. We were never granted full membership. We have observer status. We always have had observer status." I stopped walking. The corridor was empty except for us. Through the wide, arching windows, I could see the planet. Below Conclave Prime, a blue-gray world, covered in a lattice of city light that stretched from pole to pole. Somewhere in that immensity, 61 civilizations were going about their days, none of them particularly troubled by what had just happened to mine. "So there's nothing we do," I said. Director Asai looked at me with an expression I did not understand at the time. It was not the expression of a person who had given up. It was the expression of a person who was already 5 steps past the conversation we were having. "I didn't say that," she said. Then she took out a small device, pressed a single key, and a message went out. I didn't know where it went. I didn't know what it said. I only found out later, much later, that in the same moment the vote board in the conclave chamber settled on its final count. Director Asai had already sent a single encrypted word to every space agency on Earth. The word was go. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my quarters on the station and read the decree 17 times, looking for a loophole, a clause, a procedural error that could be challenged. There was nothing. It was airtight. Whoever had written it had known exactly what they were doing. Around 2:00 in the morning, station time, a message came through on my personal line. It was from my younger sister, Nina, who worked as an engineer at a launch facility in the Kalahari. She was not supposed to contact me on this channel. It was a secured diplomatic line, and she had no clearance for it. The message was 4 words long. "We're already moving, Kai." I read it 3 times, then I put the device down and stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying to understand what that meant. Outside the window, Conclave Prime shimmered with a billion lights. 61 civilizations, vast and ancient and certain of themselves, had just made a decision they thought was final. They had no idea what they had just started. I thought about my sister's face, sharp-eyed, always a little impatient, the kind of person who solved a problem before most people had finished describing it. I thought about Director Asai's expression in that corridor, the one that was already 5 steps ahead. I thought about the vote board showing 61 and 0, a number that was supposed to feel like a door closing. It did not feel like that anymore. It felt like a starting gun. I got up from the chair, washed my face, and began packing my bag. I didn't know. Yet where I was going, I didn't know. What Project Scatter was, or how many. Ships were already spinning up there. Drives in the dark on the far side of Earth's moon. I didn't know that 11 months from now, the Conclave would activate a containment field around a solar system. That would be, by that point, significantly less full of humans than they expected. All I knew was that when Director Oz had heard the word exile, she had not heard a sentence. She had heard a deadline. And somewhere back on Earth, my sister and about 8 million other people were making sure we met it. I zipped up the bag. I took one last look at Conclave Prime through the window, at all those careful, ordered, ancient lights. Noted, I said quietly, the way Director Oz had said it to the chamber. Then I turned off the light and walked out. The first thing that hit me when I landed back on Earth was not the smell of the air or the weight of real gravity. After months on the station, it was the noise, not chaos, that was the strange part. It was the noise of enormous coordinated effort, the kind that only happens when millions of people are all working on the same thing at the same time, and every one of them knows exactly what they are supposed to be doing. Launch facilities ran 24-hour shifts. Cargo transports moved in convoys. Through the night, their headlights cutting long white lines across the desert. Radio channels that had been quiet for years were alive with clipped technical conversation. I had been back on Earth for 6 hours before anyone explained Project Scatter to me, and by the time they did, I had already seen enough to understand the shape of it. My contact was a man named Owen Calloway, mid-40s, trim, with a kind of permanent exhaustion behind his eyes. That comes from working on something enormous for a long time in secret. He met me at a logistics hub outside Cape Town, handed me a coffee that I drank in 2 swallows, and walked me directly into the operations room. Without small talk, the room was filled with screens. Every screen showed a different piece of the same picture: manifest lists, orbital trajectories, fuel load calculations, biome canisters, DNA archive, inventories, prefab manufacturing cores, water reclamation units. Along one wall, a map of the galaxy showed a scatter of tiny green dots. Beyond the borders of Conclave, recognized space, each one marking a star system that had been quietly surveyed and assessed over the past decade by deep-range probes that no one had officially announced. Owen stood beside the map and let me look at it for a moment. "How long has this been in planning?" I asked. "The survey probe started going out 9 years ago," he said. "The logistics framework has been active for 3. The actual loading operation began 6 days after the first intelligence reports suggested the Conclave was building toward a vote. 6 days after," I repeated, "before the vote even happened. Director Oz said to plan for the worst outcome." I looked at the green dots on the map. There were dozens of them. I counted 37 before I stopped counting and just stared. "Each of those is a destination?" I asked. "Each of those is a viable colony site," he said. "Breathable atmosphere or terraformable within 1 generation. Water sources confirmed, no existing intelligent life within detection range. Some of them are marginal, cold or dry, or far from their star, but they're ours." The word hit me strangely. Ours, not Earth's, not humanity's in the abstract. Legal sense the conclave had debated. Just ours, simple and direct. How many ships? I asked. Owen pulled up a secondary display. The number on it took my breath away. 4,216. Vessels ranging from converted deep space freighters large enough to carry 10,000 people each down to compact colony seaters carrying 200. A skeleton crew plus frozen embryo banks. And fabrication libraries loaded with everything needed to build a civilization from bare rock. Every space agency on Earth, Owen said, every corporate fleet we could bring in, private launchers, experimental platforms that have never carried passengers before. We are putting everything we have into the sky. The conclave will see the launches, I said immediately. They'll detect the drive signatures and they'll see what we want them to see. He said the first wave launched from the night side 3 months ago using gravitational slingshots around Jupiter and Saturn to mask their warp initiations. The conclave's nearest monitoring station is 14 light minutes away. By the time their instruments register a drive signature, the ship is already in transit. We've been mapping their detection blind spots for years. He paused. We've been mapping a lot of things for years. I thought about that. I thought about how long it takes to build something this large in secret. How many people must have known, how many ordinary engineers and scientists and logistics coordinators had been quietly working on a plan to save humanity from a verdict that had not even been announced yet. They planned for a scenario where the conclave turned on us, I said. Director Osa planned for it, Owen said. She said, and I'm quoting this because I was in the room, we did not survive 40,000 years of human history by assuming that powerful institutions would always be fair to us. I didn't have anything to say to that. Owen showed me the loading manifest for my assigned ship. The vessel was called the Endurance, a name someone had chosen very deliberately. I suspected a converted deep-range survey ship that had been quietly refitted over the past 18 months into a colony carrier. Capacity, 3,000 people plus frozen reserves. Destination, a system called GJ 514. A quiet yellow star 11 light years from Earth, sitting well outside the conclave's administrative boundary, in a region of space that the conclave had never bothered to map in detail because there was nothing there that interested them. There would be soon. In the following weeks I moved through the operation like a person walking through a dream. The scale of it was hard to process in real time. I drove past loading bays where families stood in orderly lines, each person carrying one bag, moving with the quiet focus of people who had made a decision they were at peace with. I walked through cargo holds filled floor to ceiling with sealed containers, seeds, tools, construction printers, medical equipment, cultural archives, thousands of hard drives loaded with the entirety of recorded human knowledge. I sat in briefing rooms where geologists showed maps of planets none of us had ever seen, pointing to river valleys and mineral deposits and talking about them the way people talk about places they have already begun to love. Not everyone was going, that was important to understand. Project Scatter was never meant to empty Earth. Roughly 2 billion people had volunteered or been selected for the colony ships. The remaining 6 billion were staying Not because they had been left behind, because they had chosen to remain, to rebuild, to make Earth into something that the Conclave's quarantine could not diminish. Director Ose had been very clear about this in every briefing I attended. The people staying on Earth were not the ones who had given up. They were the ones fighting a different part of the same battle. But it was a battle fought without weapons, which I still found difficult to fully accept. Why aren't we fighting it legally? I asked Owen one evening in the small break room off the operations center. Both of us too tired to do much more than sit and drink bad coffee. The decree has procedural violations. The charter doesn't give the Conclave authority to impose containment on non-member species without a hearing. Owen finished. Yes, we know. The legal team has been building that argument for 8 months. He looked at his cup. But think about what winning that argument gets us. Best case, the Conclave agrees to hold a new vote, then they vote 61-0 again. But this time with the correct paperwork. We're back where we started, except we've spent 11 months in legal proceedings instead of getting people out. I looked at the map on the wall, a small printed version of the one in the operations room, slightly outdated but still covered in green dots. So we're not fighting the Exile, I said. Slowly. We're making it irrelevant, Owen said. There's a difference. That was the night it finally settled into place for me. The full shape of what Director Ose had seen from the beginning, standing on that reflective floor in the Conclave chamber while the vote board showed 61-0. She had not heard a sentence. She had heard a deadline, and she had understood instinctively that the most powerful response to someone trying to contain you is not to argue against the container. It is to be somewhere else before the lid comes down. The months moved fast after that. I threw myself into the logistics work, coordinating communications between the scattered teams and the diplomatic mission, making sure the Conclave saw exactly what we wanted them to see, a quiet, compliant humanity preparing for separation, processing the decree with appropriate solemnity. We sent carefully worded acknowledgments. We attended the procedural follow-up sessions. We filed the required documentation. We were the picture of dignified acceptance. Behind that picture, 4,000 ships were leaving Earth in the dark. I met the people who would be on my ship during the final briefing week, 3,000 of them, engineers, doctors, teachers, farmers, builders, children. A woman named Harriet Cole who had spent 20 years as a marine biologist and was going to spend the next 20 figuring out the ocean chemistry of a planet she had never visited. A man named George Adler, who was 58 years old and had insisted on joining because, as he put it to me with complete seriousness, he was not going to spend his remaining years being told where he was allowed to exist. George became one of my favorite people. The night before we launched, I called my sister Nina. She was still at the facility in the Kalahari. She was in the staying group, one of the engineers who would keep Earth's own space infrastructure running after the field went up. You should be the one going, I told her. Someone has to make sure the lights stay on here, she said. She looked tired but steady. You'll check in when you can. When I can, I said. The comm channels would be limited once the containment field was active. We both knew that. Kai, she said, they think they've Ended us. I know. Let them think that for a while, she said. It'll make it better when they find out. I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in months. It felt strange and good at the same time. The next morning, the Endurance lifted from the launch pad at 400 local time. In the dark and the quiet, joining a stream of ships that had been quietly bleeding into space for months. No ceremony, no speeches. The launch was deliberately ordinary because ordinary was invisible, and invisible was exactly what we needed to be. I stood at the observation port and watched Earth grow small behind us. It did not look like a condemned world. It looked like what it was, a living planet, patient and blue, full of people who had decided that a verdict delivered by 61 distant civilizations was not, in the end, the final word on what humanity was allowed to do. Somewhere in the conclave chamber, the vote board still showed its numbers, 61 and 0, a count that was supposed to feel permanent. It had about 11 months left before it stopped meaning anything at all. The Endurance entered warp transition at 8:47. The stars outside stretched and folded. Earth disappeared. Whatever came next, we were already in it. I did not expect the silence of deep space to feel like freedom. In the months I had spent on conclave station, silence had always felt like pressure, the specific pressure of being somewhere you were tolerated but not wanted, where every quiet moment carried the awareness of how many voices in those halls considered your species problem to be managed. That kind of silence makes you shrink. It makes you choose your words carefully and sit up straight and remember that you are a guest, always a guest, and guests can be asked to leave. The silence on the Endurance was different. It was immense and open and completely indifferent to human politics. The dark between stars did not care what the conclave had voted. The light from GJ 514, still 11 months away and barely visible, as a slightly warmer point among a million others, did not know or care that 61 civilizations had decided humanity was a problem. The universe outside that observation port was not against us. It was simply waiting. I spent a lot of time at that observation port. The ship ran on a regular schedule, work shifts, meal rotations, exercise time, sleep cycles. 3,000 people in close quarters over 11 months require structure, and the crew had built it thoughtfully. There were arguments, of course, tensions, moments when the weight of what we had left behind became too heavy to carry quietly. I handled more than a few disputes in those early months, mostly between people who were frightened and expressing it sideways, in the way frightened people often do. But there was something else underneath all of it, something I had not expected and did not know how to name at first. About 2 months into the journey, I was walking through the lower cargo level during an off-shift hour, doing a routine check of the archive containers, when I heard voices coming from one of the small equipment bays. I looked through the open door and saw a group of about 15 people, ranging from their 20s to their 60s, sitting in a rough circle on storage crates. A woman named Clara Finch, 30-something, a structural engineer from Glasgow, was showing a hand-drawn map to the group. It was a rough sketch of what she imagined GJ 514's primary planet might look like based on the probe data and her own extrapolations. They were planning where to build things. Not anxiously, not desperately, with genuine enthusiasm. They were arguing about whether the first permanent structure should be positioned near the river delta that the probe data suggested existed on the southern continent or higher on the plateau above it where the weather patterns might be more predictable. They were debating the merits of prefab, modular construction versus site-built stone structures for long-term durability. Someone had already given the planet name. They were calling it Ren after no particular reason except that someone had said it out loud one day and it had stuck. I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening. These were people who had left behind homes, careers, families, an entire world they had known their whole lives, to go to a cold rock orbiting a star no one had named yet. They had been exiled by 61 civilizations in a vote that took less time than a meal, and they were sitting in a cargo bay, drawing maps of where to put the hospital. I went back to my quarters and wrote a long message to Director Asai. It went into a delayed queue. We could not transmit in real time through warp and would not reach her for days. I told her what I had seen. I told her I had finally understood something I had been slow to grasp. The conclave had framed their decree in the language of containment. They saw the exile as a way of stopping something, stopping human expansion, stopping human unpredictability, stopping the disruption that human contact seemed to cause everywhere it reached. They imagined exile as a wall. But a wall only works if the thing inside it is trying to get out through the wall. We were not interested in the wall. We had already gone around it. Her reply came 11 days later, 2 lines long. You're describing something the conclave has never successfully modeled. They assume all species ultimately want the same things. They want recognition, status, a seat at the established table. They do not understand a species that builds its own table and invites everyone else to sit down. I read that twice, then pinned it to the wall above my bunk. 3 months into the journey, the first significant news reached us through tight beam relay that our ship's communication officer, a quiet young man named Patrick Greer, had managed to establish with a relay buoy left in the outer system before we departed. It came in compressed fragments, text only, but it was enough. The conclave had activated the containment field around Sol. The report from the monitoring team Earth had left in place described it in flat technical language, a spherical energy boundary, precisely calibrated, positioned at the outer edge of the heliopause. From outside, the Sol system looked the same as always. From inside, nothing larger than a microbe could pass through the field in either direction without triggering a shutdown response. Earth was sealed. The conclave's announcement to the galactic community was brief and procedural. And GT snorts. And GT, protective separation of the Sol system, had been successfully implemented. The human variable had been contained. The decree was now in full effect. Any species found providing material assistance to contained humans would be subject to review. What the announcement did not mention, because the conclave did not yet know, was that the Sol system it had just sealed contained approximately 6 billion humans rather than the 8 billion who had been there a year earlier. It did not know about the 4,000 ships that had left in waves over 11 months, masked behind gas giants and thermal signatures, and the simple fact that the Conclave's monitoring infrastructure, the outer sol system, had been built to watch for incoming threats, not outgoing, quiet ones. It did not know about Ren or the 36 other destinations where human colony ships were currently in transit or had already arrived. Patrick Greer delivered the news to the ship during the evening meal rotation. 3,000 people went quiet for about 30 seconds, then George Adler, who was sitting across the table from me with a bowl of reconstituted vegetable soup, said clearly and calmly, "Well, they sealed an empty cage." Someone laughed, then someone else did. Then the whole dining bay was laughing. Not cruelly, not triumphantly, just with the deep, releasing laughter of people who have been frightened for a long time and have just realized that the thing they were afraid of is already behind them. The remaining months of the journey had a different character after that. The weight lifted, the arguments became more practical and less sharp. Planning groups multiplied, not just Clara's engineering circle, but medical teams mapping out clinic layouts, teachers building curriculum frameworks for children who would grow up on a world that had no history yet, agronomists running soil simulations and debating irrigation systems. The Endurance felt less like a vessel flight and more like a community in formation. We arrived at GJ 514 on a Tuesday. I remember that clearly because George had made a point of tracking the days and telling everyone what Earth Day it was each morning, partly as a joke and partly as something more serious, a thread of continuity, a reminder that we carried our time with us. The planet Ren was visible from the observation deck as a pale blue-brown disk half lit by its star, crossed by white cloud bands that shifted slowly over what the probe data said were wide, shallow oceans. It was smaller than Earth and slightly colder, with shorter days and a year that ran about 310 Earth days. The gravity was fractionally lighter, which the doctors said would take some getting used to, but presented no long-term concerns. It was, by any objective measure, not a spectacular planet. It was not the most hospitable of our 37 destination worlds. It was not the richest in resources or the most comfortable in climate. But when the Endurance broke through the upper atmosphere and the first real sunrise I had seen in 11 months turned the horizon gold and rose and deep amber, and I looked out the window at a sky that had never been named by anyone. Before we arrived, I understood something that I could not have understood from a map or a probe readout. It was ours, not in the way that the Conclave claimed. Space with treaties and borders and administrative zones on charts, ours in the way that a home is yours because we were here, because we had come. The landing site was a flat grassland near the eastern coast of the northern continent, beside a river that ran clear and cold over a bed of pale stones. Grass was the wrong shade of green, slightly more yellow than earth grass, catching the light of a slightly different sun, and the air smelled of salt and something faintly mineral that I had no word for. The gravity settled into my bones like a deep breath. 3,000 people walked out of the Endurance and stood in an alien field under an alien sky, and most of them were smiling. Clara Finch walked up beside me and looked around at the landscape for a moment, then she pulled out her hand-drawn map from the cargo bay and held it up, comparing her sketch to the actual horizon. Rivers farther east than I drew it. She said critically. You drew it from probe data on a ship. At warp, I said. Still, she folded the map and put it away. The plateau looks right, though. We should start the survey tomorrow. She walked off toward where the equipment team was beginning to unload the construction printers. George appeared at my shoulder with 2 cups of the coffee we had been saving for arrival, real coffee, not the reconstituted variety beans that someone had packed with the clear intention of making this moment ceremonial. He handed me a cup. Think the conclave knows yet? He asked. No, I said. They think they've contained us. George looked out at the yellow-green grass in the cold river and the sky. That was a slightly deeper blue than Earth's. He sipped his coffee. Let them think that for a bit longer, he said. My sister said the same thing. He nodded slowly. Smart woman. I drank the coffee. It was good. It tasted like Earth, which was something I had not realized I was missing until that moment when I was standing somewhere else entirely. Above us, the second landing craft from the Endurance was making its approach, engines reflecting gold in the morning light. Somewhere across 37 star systems, thousands of other ships were doing the same thing, setting down, walking out, looking around at worlds that had never known a human footstep, and starting to change that. The containment field around Sol was active. Earth was sealed, and humanity was already 37 places at once. 3 years is a long time when you are building a world, and it is a very short time when you are trying to hide from one. By the time the conclave figured out what had happened, we had already stopped hiding. I was in the middle of a routine inventory meeting when Patrick Greer knocked on the door of the colony's central communications room and told me that a conclave intelligence vessel had been detected entering the outer edge of the Cathar expanse, a vast, loosely mapped region of space in which 4 of our colony worlds sat, including the second largest human settlement outside Earth, a colony called Greenville on a world we had named Duran. The conclave ship was a standard survey class vessel, unarmed, moving slowly. It was not there for military reasons. It was there because 3 years after implementing what they believed was a total quarantine, something had started showing up in their data networks that did not make sense. Trading records from small species in the outer fringe showed exchanges of tools and materials that matched no known conclave registered manufacturer. A pre-contact civilization on a small ocean world called Merit had been observed constructing water filtration systems of a design that had not appeared anywhere in the conclave's technology catalogs. Most troubling of all, a merchant vessel from the Sarathi had filed a report noting that a planet in Grid Sector 9, Cathar, previously listed as uninhabited Class 3 rock, appeared to now have lights visible from orbit. Humans are not subtle about their lights. When the conclave intelligence vessel arrived in orbit above Duran, they found a colony of approximately 42,000 people who had been there for 2 years, building steadily and with no particular interest in being discovered, but equally no plans to run or hide if they were. The colony's administrator was a woman named Helen Marsh, a former city planner from Bristol who had the organizational instincts of a person who had once managed the infrastructure of a city of 2 million people and found a colony of 40,000 somewhat relaxing by comparison. Helen received the conclave's official query transmission, read it carefully, and sent back a reply that I later obtained a transcript of and have read many times since. The reply was in full: "Hello, we are human settlers from Earth. We have been here for approximately 2 years. We are not causing any harm and we are not leaving. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them. We have coffee." The conclave intelligence officer did not know what coffee was. His follow-up queries were extremely confused. I heard about the Durin contact through our relay network 3 days after it happened, and I immediately put through an urgent message to Director Asai, who at that point was still on Earth. Her reply came back in fragments over the next week, and when I assembled them into a full message, the overall tone was one of measured, deliberate calm that I had come to understand was her version of deep satisfaction. The contact was always going to happen, she wrote. 42,000 people living on a planet that is visible from orbit were never going to stay invisible. What matters now is how we respond to the contact, not whether it happened. Helen Marsh has the right instincts. Keep the tone honest and unbothered. We have nothing to apologize for. Unbothered, that was the word she used. And it was exactly right. Because the conclave's response to finding Durin was not, as I had half feared, an immediate and aggressive effort to remove the colony. It was confusion. The conclave's enforcement frameworks had no good model for what to do with 42,000 humans who had set up a fully functioning community on a world outside conclave jurisdiction and were, by all observable metrics, being perfectly good neighbors to the local species they had encountered. The conclave charter gave the council authority over its member species and recognized worlds. It gave them the power to sanction, to quarantine, to restrict. It did not give them a clear procedure for handling a non-member species that had simply gone somewhere they had not thought to cover in their rule book. They sent 3 enforcement vessels to Durin over the following 6 months. Each one arrived in orbit with formal demands for evacuation. Each time Helen Marsh responded politely, explained that the colony had established residency on an unclaimed world according to every relevant legal principle the conclave's own charter recognized, provided detailed documentation of their land surveys, their agreements with the one sentient species in the Durin system, a small, non-spacefaring bird-like people called the Oreth, who had been delighted by the humans and had established a trading relationship within 6 months of first contact, and declined to leave after the 3rd enforcement vessel departed without having achieved anything. The council convened an emergency session. I know what happened in that session because Councillor Veth of the Velhari contacted me directly for the first time since the Exile vote, using a private channel that should not have existed and which I carefully did not ask him about. They are frightened, he said. He looked older than I remembered. There was something in his face that I had not seen there before, not the careful, diplomatic blankness of a conclave counselor, but something rawer and more personal. Not of your weapons. You have no weapons that concern them. They are frightened because they cannot find the edge of you. I'm not sure I understand, I said. You were supposed to be one place. Veth said, one world, one star, one contained point on a map. That was manageable. That was the shape of the problem they thought they were solving. But you are not one place, you are everywhere they look now, during the two settlements in the Drift Corridor, the colony near the Marid system that has been helping the ocean people build clean water systems. He paused. 3 days ago, a conclave deep survey vessel found a human presence in a system in the inner Karath zone. That system is listed in the conclave's own records as fully administered space. I kept my face neutral. I had known about the inner Karath settlement, a small group of about 200 people on an outpost that was technically within the outer edge of conclave administrative territory. It had been a calculated risk. What did the survey vessel report? I asked. That there were 206 humans on the surface, that they had established a small trading post, and that the local Karath species had sent a formal petition to the Conclave Council asking that the humans be allowed to stay. Veth's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one I had seen from him. The Karath are a full-member species. Their petition carries weight. I absorbed this quietly. One of the things that had become clear in the years since Scatter was that the Conclave's model of humanity as a disruptive, aggressive variable had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the disruption. We were not disruptive in the way that an invading species is disruptive. We were disruptive in the way that a very active, curious, friendly neighbor is disruptive, constantly building things, constantly talking to people, constantly forming connections that nobody had pre-approved. The smaller civilizations of the outer and middle conclave zones did not find us threatening. They found us useful and interesting, and in several cases, genuinely fun to be around. This was not something the Conclave had modeled for. Why are you contacting me, counselor? I asked. Veth was quiet for a moment, then he said, because I voted in favor of the decree. I know. I should not have, he said. I want you to know that I know that. It was not an apology. The Velhari did not apologize easily, and I respected that about them too much to pretend the statement was more than it was. But it was an acknowledgement, and from Veth that meant more than most people's formal apologies. Thank you for telling me, I said. There is something else, he said. Purely as information, a faction within the council is arguing that the enforcement attempts against your colonies are counterproductive. They believe that sending vessels to demand evacuation simply broadcast to the entire galaxy that the council has lost control of the situation. There is a growing position that the better path is to open negotiations. Negotiations, I said, toward what? That, Veth said, is what nobody has agreed on yet. He ended the transmission. I sat with it for a while. The thing about negotiations is that they require both parties to want something the other has. I thought about what the Conclave had that humanity wanted: recognition, safety from future decrees, a place in the galactic community that did not depend on the goodwill of 61 other species. Those things mattered. But I also thought about what we had now, that we had not had 3 years ago: 37 worlds, over 2 million people settled outside the Sol system, trading relationships with dozens of species that the Conclave had written off as too small or too primitive to matter. a network of human settlements that was already providing medical technology, agricultural techniques, engineering, expertise, and basic infrastructure too. Communities that the conclave had left, largely alone for centuries. We had leverage we had not had before. More than leverage, actually, we had different kind of power, the kind that does not come from weapons or threats, but from being genuinely needed, from being the people who showed up with clean water systems and asked for nothing in return except permission to stay, from building hospitals and learning languages and sitting down at trading tables with species that the conclave had cataloged and then ignored. I wrote a long report to Director Ose. That night I told her about Veth's call. I told her about the internal conclave faction. I told her that I thought the moment was coming when we would need to decide what we actually wanted from any future engagement, not what we would accept, but what we would ask for. She replied 3 weeks later. I've been waiting for you to ask that question, she wrote. Start thinking about answers. The council will reach out formally within the year. When they do, we should already know what we want the room to look like. Outside, the stars were sharp and cold. Above Ren's thin atmosphere, George Adler was sitting on the front step of the building we had converted into a temporary administration office, looking up at them with the patient, unhurried expression he wore when he was thinking about something large. Veth called, I told him. The Velhari one who stayed quiet during the vote. Yes. George nodded slowly. He feel bad about it. As close to it as he's likely to get. Good, George said without heat. They should all feel bad about it. He looked back up at the sky. Then they should do something about it. Feeling bad is only the first step. He was right about that. Feeling bad was only the first step. The question was, what came next? 37 worlds away, humans were building hospitals and trading posts and schools. They were drawing maps of continents no human eye had seen before. They were making friends in species whose names most people on Earth had never heard, in places the conclave had not bothered to look at closely enough to protect or claim. The council had exiled us to make us small. Instead, we had become 40. The negotiations were coming. Director Ose knew it. Veth knew it. I knew it. We just needed to make sure that when the conclave finally called us back to the table, we came with more chairs than they had seats for. The formal invitation arrived on a Wednesday. It came through official conclave diplomatic channels, a properly formatted request for engagement, sealed with the council's authentication code, addressed to the human representative network rather than to Earth. Specifically, that detail mattered. Addressing the human representative network rather than Earth or the Sol mission was an implicit acknowledgement, the first one the council had ever made, in a formal document, that humanity was no longer a single-point entity. We were a network. The conclave was recognizing, in the careful language of interstellar diplomacy, that they could no longer pretend otherwise. Director Ose's response went out within the hour. I was in the communications room on Ren when Patrick Greer pulled up the text of it. It was 2 sentences long. We accept the invitation to engage. We will need a larger room. I read it twice, then I put the message down and looked out the window at the yellow-green grass bending in the Afternoon wind and laughed until my eyes watered. 7 years since a vote. Board in a pale stone chamber had shown 61 and 0 and 0, and Director Osa had stood on a reflective floor and said noted like she was already thinking about something else. 7 years since my sister had sent me 4 words on a secure line, we're already moving Kai. 7 years since the Endurance had lifted from a launch pad in the dark, and I had watched Earth shrink to a blue point in a sea of nothing. The Council had asked for a diplomatic re-engagement session. They wanted it held on Conclave Prime in the formal chamber, the same chamber where the Exile decree had been read. I understood the psychology of that request immediately. They wanted the setting to reinforce their authority, to remind whoever walked in that this was the seat of galactic governance, that whatever informal network humanity had assembled out in the fringe, here in this room, the established order still mattered. We agreed to their venue. We had nothing to prove about rooms. What we sent through their doors was something else. The human delegation to the re-engagement session consisted of 43 representatives, 1 from Earth and 1 from each of the recognized colony worlds. Some of the colonies were small enough that their delegate was the only qualified diplomat on the planet and had never attended a formal interstellar session before. Some of them were geologists or engineers or doctors who had been elected or appointed by their communities in the way that small, self-organizing groups elect people, by pointing at whoever seemed most sensible and saying, "You go, we trust you." When I walked into that chamber as part of the delegation, the first thing I saw was the conclave representatives registering the number of humans coming through the door. I watched the quiet recalibration happening in real time, the Sci-Fi observer doing that arm-folding motion, the Andre presiding voice pausing its preamble mid-sentence for 3 full seconds before continuing. The Velhari delegation, for their part, showed nothing but Counselor Veth, sitting in his usual position in the outer ring, caught my eye when I found my seat and gave me the smallest possible nod. The 43 of us took our seats. The chamber was not in fact large enough to accommodate us comfortably. Several colony delegates were seated in temporary chairs added hastily along one side. George Adler, who had insisted on attending as Wren's representative, despite having no formal diplomatic credentials whatsoever, and who had been cleared through 3 escalating security protocols before anyone could stop arguing about his credentials long enough to just let him through, sat 2 seats to my left with the expression of a person who was exactly where they had decided to be and had no interest in being anywhere else. Director O's sat at the center of our delegation. She was 68 years old now. Her hair was entirely silver and she had a new scar along one wrist from a manufacturing accident in one of Earth's rebuilding programs, a fact that I found out later from someone who had been there. She sat with her folder closed on the table in front of her and looked out at 61 other delegations and said nothing, waiting with perfect patience for the session to begin. The Andre presiding voice opened the session by welcoming the human observer delegation and then stopped because 43 voices said quietly but clearly and simultaneously, "Delegations," and then went silent again. The correction landed the way it was Meant to. Observer delegation was what we had been. 7 years ago, one voice observer status. Present by permission, delegations. Plural was what we were now, they. Distinction carried everything. The first 2 hours of the session were procedural, which is to say they were the conclave trying to establish a framework in which they remained clearly in charge of the proceedings while making enough concessions to keep the human network at the table. I had been in enough diplomatic sessions to recognize the moves, the framing of humanity as a special case requiring ongoing assessment, the language of provisional engagement pending review, the careful placement of qualifiers around every statement of recognition. I let it run. Director Ose, I let it run. We had agreed before the session that the first phase was theirs to control, let them feel the architecture. Let them build the frame, then step through it. It was Helen Marsh of Durin who changed the register of the room, and she did it with a question rather than a statement. During a pause in the procedural discussion, Helen raised her hand, gesture so casually human that it apparently caused 2 Andre Jr. aides visible confusion, and said, "I have a practical question, if I may." The presiding voice acknowledged her. "The world we've settled, which we call Dern, it was listed in your survey catalog as uninhabited class 3. We've been there for over 5 years. We have 42,000 residents, a trading relationship with the native Orath people, a school system, 2 medical facilities, and a sustainable food production system that we've shared with the Orath free of charge. What is the council's current position on our residency status?" The chamber was quiet. The conclave's lead representative, species I will not name because they would prefer not to be identified in this account, and GT snorts, and GT paused for a long moment and then said that the matter of human residency on non-registered worlds was one of the items under review in the current engagement framework. Helen nodded pleasantly. "So it's not yet resolved?" "Correct." "While it's unresolved," she said, "are we expected to leave, and if so, what is the council's proposed mechanism for relocating 42,000 people and their 5 years of infrastructure?" More silence. The question was perfectly reasonable. The conclave had no answer for it, because the answer required them to either admit that they had no legal authority to compel us to leave, or to attempt to compel 42,000 people to abandon their homes, at which point they would have to explain to the 41 other colony worlds what that policy implied for them as well. The math was not in the council's favor, and everyone in that chamber could do it. There were 37 more Helen Marshes in the room, 43 total if you counted Director Osai, which you absolutely should. The session lasted 4 days. I will not walk through all of it. Some of it was technical and dry, some of it was emotionally raw in ways I do not have the right to describe for other people. But snorts, I will tell you the shape of how it moved. On the first day, the conclave controlled the proceedings. On the second day, the practical questions started coming from the colony delegates, questions about residency, about trading rights, about the status of the interspecies relationships we had built and the conclave's prepared framework began to show its seams. On the third day, 3 member species submitted requests to speak in support of expanded human engagement. The Kareth the Oreth, and a small aquatic species from the Merit system whose name I still cannot pronounce, but who had sent their eldest council member on a 4-month journey to be in that chamber and say in their own language that the humans who had come to their world had built them clean water and asked for friendship in return, and the conclave had done neither. On the 4th day, the Andre presiding voice read the revised statement of engagement. It was not everything, it was not full membership, not yet. It recognized human settlements on non-registered worlds as provisional residents with protected status. It recognized the human representative network as a legitimate diplomatic entity. It created a new category in the conclave's membership framework: associated civilization, distinct from full member, distinct from observer, that acknowledged a species might exist in multiple locations and be represented by multiple voices simultaneously. It was written entirely around us, without mentioning us by name, because naming us directly would have required the council to say aloud that they had been wrong. We let them have that. It was a small thing to let them keep. The containment field around Saul was not discussed in the formal proceedings. It was decommissioned 3 weeks after the session, quietly and without announcement. Earth detected the chain in its sensor arrays before the conclave sent any notification. My sister was one of the technicians who confirmed it. She sent me a message that was characteristically 4 words long. The lights are on. Earth had spent 7 years in isolation. What emerged was not the battered, diminished world the conclave had perhaps imagined, the world of a species chastened by separation and grateful to be let back in. The Earth that came out of 7 years of quarantine had rebuilt its own infrastructure from the ground up, had run its own internal communications networks free of conclave oversight, had developed technologies the rest of the galaxy did not have, and had perhaps most significantly rediscovered something about itself that the long centuries of trying to join the galactic community had partially buried. Earth did not need the conclave's approval to exist. It had learned that in the hardest possible way, and it had come through the lesson intact. The last day of the session, after everything was signed and the chamber was emptying out, I found Director Asai standing at the edge of the main floor, the same reflective floor where she had stood 7 years ago, listening to 61 species vote against us. She was looking down at her own reflection in it just for a moment. I stood beside her. Was this what you saw? I asked. When they read the decree, was this what you were already thinking about? She considered the question for a moment. Not specifically, she said. I did not know about GJ 514 or Ren or 43 delegates in an undersized chamber. I didn't have that level of detail. She paused. What I knew was that this was not the end. I knew that because I know what we are, not what we're supposed to be or what they decided we were, what we actually are. What are we? I asked. She looked up from the floor and out at the emptying chamber. The last few alien delegates gathering their materials, the Valhari ambassador Veth pausing near the door to look back at us once before leaving, the morning light from the station's arc windows falling across the pale stone in long gold stripes. We are the species, she said, that here's you cannot go there, and starts packing. George found us there a few minutes Later, his hands in his pockets, looking as unbothered as ever. He had apparently spent some of the previous day's break period teaching several Kareth Jr. aides a card game that may or may not have been entirely legal in conclave administrative space. So he said, "What's next?" I thought about Ren, about the yellow-green grass and the cold, clear river, and Clara Finch's slightly inaccurate hand-drawn map that turned out to be right about the plateau. I thought about 37 worlds with human footprints on them, worlds that had been silent and empty before we arrived and were now full of the noise of people building things and arguing about things and laughing and getting it wrong and trying again. I thought about the species that had already asked us to stay, that had built something with us that the conclave had never thought to offer them. I thought about my sister sending me messages in 4 words or less across 11 light years of distance. "What's next?" I said. "Is everything else?" George nodded as if that was a satisfying and complete answer. Maybe it was. Outside, the stars were waiting. They had always been waiting. They did not care about conclave decrees or vote boards or the politics of 61 ancient civilizations debating the fate of a species they had profoundly misjudged. They were just out there the way they had always been, uncountable, open, waiting for whoever was willing to go. We had always been willing to go. That was the thing no one in that chamber, not 7 years ago and not today, had ever fully understood about us. It was not that we refused exile. It was that exile as a concept had never quite applied to us the way it applied to other species. Exile works on a people who are defined by their place, who are what they are because of where they stand, because of a particular patch of ground or a single sun in a particular sky. We were not that. We had not been that. For a long time, maybe never. We were defined by motion, by the next horizon, by the persistent, inarguable, slightly exhausting human conviction that wherever we were was a beginning, not an end. The conclave had tried to take our place from us. They did not understand that we had already become something that did not need just one. I walked out of the conclave chamber, behind Director Osa and George Adler, and behind us came 40 other humans, builders, doctors, farmers, engineers, one former marine biologist and one city planner, and one retired man from somewhere in England who had never held a diplomatic title in his life. And we walked out into the corridor and then out of the building and into the light of a sun that was not ours and did not need to be. The vote board inside was dark now, all the numbers gone. A new count was beginning somewhere in the records of 37 worlds and the lives of 2 million people and the quiet, ongoing, unstoppable work of a species that had been told to stay put and had said in the most practical way possible, "No." We walked toward the transit bay where our ships were docked. George was already talking about coffee. The stars were waiting. We were already going.